Good morning, everyone. It is Saturday, December the 7th, 2019. It is currently 11:20 a.m. Central Time. Well, today is December the 7th. And because it's December the 7th, it's almost impossible to hit the go live button, do a live broadcast, and not talk about what occurred on this day, 1941. December the 7th, 1941. We need to take a few minutes out of our busy day and remember what occurred and think about it. Now, yes, we can look at it from a historical perspective, and there's plenty of things to think about in regards to the history. We can look at it from what lessons we can learn in regards to the times in which we live. We could do that. Obviously, this is a theological podcast, so I'm going to look at it more from a spiritual perspective. But let's remind ourselves of what occurred on this day, on December the 7th, 1941. You probably know, I'm assuming everyone knows, but today, December the 7th, 1941, is the day that we remember the attack on Pearl Harbor. It was a surprise preemptive military strike by the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service upon the United States, which was a neutral country at the time, against the and this attack was against the naval base at Pearl Harbor in Honolulu, Hawaii. It occurred just before 8 a.m. on Sunday morning, December the 7th, 1941. The attack led to the United States' formal entry into World War II. The next day, the Japanese military leadership referred to the attack as the Hawaii Operation, and Operation, I believe, AI, and as Operation Z during its planning. The next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared war on Japan. Now, that's the basic information that everyone knows, but this is what I want to do. What did it sound like on December the 7th, 1941? What did people hear? What the average American, what did they hear when they turned on their radio? Now, one thing you may not realize is that in December the 7th, 1941, when the radio broadcast did report on it, they didn't go 24-hour. No, they would be like, hey, there was an attack on Pearl Harbor, and they would give a basic information and then go back to music and back to advertisements and other things. So what I have done is there's a number of videos floating around the internet where they compiled, all kinds of reports. They don't give you an actual feel for how it occurred, and I may come back and play some that kind of give a more actual and a more accurate feel, but just understand that in modern times, when something big happens, you break in and it's just wall-to-wall coverage. Just keep talking about it. Then they broke in, kind of told what happened, and went right back into their normal programming, right back into music, right back into advertisements. I was listening to one today, and they kept having an advertisement for Jell-O, right? And it almost seemed like weird, like, hey, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Hey, this hour is brought to you by Jell-O. And it's kind of like, whoa, that's kind of weird the way it happened. But it was a different time. Obviously, they didn't even have the ability probably to go 24 hours to talk about it because they didn't even really have that much information. So some will say, well, some will argue, well, they did things better back then because they didn't have all the information. They didn't just keep talking. And it is true today. Sometimes the news media will go, 24 hours basically go, just go continuous coverage over a situation, whether it's a shooting, and they're just sometimes you feel like that they've been on the air for an hour and you're like, you've said the same thing 15 times. Or they'll report information and then come back 20 minutes later to correct the information they reported because they themselves really don't have all the information. In some ways, it would be better to break in, say, here's the initial report. We'll break back in when we have more information instead of just continuing to say the same thing. I don't know. Some would argue that would be better. Some would argue that it would be worse. But it does show a contrast in times in that way. But I've got some audio here And I'm going to play some of this so that you can kind of hear. And I'm just going to, I wanted to look at this from I will say this before I play this audio. I will say this. The attack on Pearl Harbor obviously was an attack that will never be forgotten. It did bring the United States into World War II. Now, some would argue that we should have already been involved in World War II before the attack on Pearl Harbor because of all the things happening in Europe and with Germany and different things along those lines. And we could have a long, discussion about all of that. But this is what I would say. And I just want to at least throw this idea out there. Yes, we've got the history. We got the politics. We got all the contrast between time, how things were handled then versus now. And there were a lot of things said back then. I was listening to some audio clips today. There were some things said back then that was kind of shocking. There were people literally calling for the eradication and the extermination of the Japanese race. Not just like defeat this country in war. And they were literally, I was listening to audio clips of people saying, no, let's round up all Japanese, everyone who is of Japanese descent, round them up and lock them up. Some wanted them locked up for good. Some of them basically wanted them to be killed. It was shocking to hear that. And again, it's just the way people respond to these kinds of things. Others were like, no, I don't blame them as a race. I blame the country. And I believe, and some were saying, I believe people within that country are probably opposed to this war just as we are. So was shocking to hear some of that. But in spite of all those things we could talk about, I do want to at least offer kind of an analogy. As Christians, we sometimes forget that we are involved in a spiritual war. We know we have the enemy of the world. We have the enemy of the flesh. And we have the enemy of the devil. And at any time, a surprise attack can occur. And sometimes that surprise attack can be devastating to our spiritual lives. And again, sometimes it's our own flesh, sometimes it's the world, sometimes it's the devil. We know the devil's not omnipresent, so we got to make sure we're theologically correct here. But the analogy holds that we are involved in a spiritual war, and sometimes we act as if like we're isolated and we don't need to worry about the war. The war is never going to come to us, and we don't know what's going on over there, and we don't know what's going on over there, but we're okay, and we live our lives almost like we're in a time of peace. Spiritually, we sometimes do that. And then the next thing you know, we find ourselves in a major situation. So the attack on Pearl Harbor, just thinking about it from a theological perspective, some of you in your spiritual lives, you've experienced your own version of a spiritual Pearl Harbor, where the next thing you know, an attack occurred and it was devastating and destructive. Some of you may have never felt and experienced an attack that is like a Pearl Harbor spiritually, but you have maybe not experienced anything like that. But here's what I want you to know. You're still in a spiritual war, whether you feel like you've experienced an attack or not, or whether you felt like you've been able to withstand many of the attacks. But listen, here's the thing. For those who have experienced an attack and fell horribly, please know that there is grace and mercy and forgiveness and restoration and reconciliation through the blood of Jesus Christ. We have a God who sent his son to die, and through his blood, there is the forgiveness of sin. If we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us of all our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. That is sometimes as Christians, we forget that, failure occurs. There's got to be, the Christianity is about the death of Christ for the forgiveness of sins. So we need to remember that. And for those who haven't fallen, show mercy for those who have. For those who are spiritual, need to restore those who've been overtaken in a fault. Okay? But we all need to realize we are involved in a spiritual war. And how do you live in a mindset that I'm in a spiritual war without living in a complete state of paranoia? It's hard to find that balance, because on one hand you have, I'm in a spiritual war. I know that, but I don't really live any differently. And you got others who I'm in a spiritual war and they almost live in a complete state of fear and paranoia. There's got to be a biblical balance. But today is a day that we can remember what happened to our country on December the 7th, 1941. And we should just remember it from a historical perspective. What does it teach us? What can we learn? What lessons can we learn from as a nation? What lessons can we learn from it as an individual? What lessons can we learn from it, from the media to learn from it? And what can we learn from it spiritually? It's just an important day. So I'm going to just share some audio. Again, there's lots of different ways of playing the audio, but I found a couple of things. And so this is what we're going to do. I'm going to first play some of the radio broadcasts. I think there were three different radio broadcasts that are kind of all put together here. It's not aired the way it actually aired because they only did small sections and then went back to music and a regular scheduled program and then broke back in. But at least you'll get them all put together. Then we're going to listen to the only live news report that occurred on that day. There was one reporter there who was able to call back. I believe he called back to NBC and was given a report. The report only lasted for like 2 minutes, and it gets cut off because the operator breaks in and basically is saying, hey, we got an emergency. And he's like, well, I'm trying to talk to the news back in New York. And he literally gets cut off. His report gets cut off. It's really crazy. That report, sadly, has lots of sound effects added by the Smithsonian Institute. They put the video together, the audio together, and they added all these sound effects. I hate it. But the other report, you do have audio of that original report, but it's so horrible you can't really make it out. So this is the best we have. And then we'll listen to President Franklin D. Roosevelt declare a state of war on the next day. So we'll go with radio broadcast, then the only live broadcast, and then Franklin D. Roosevelt speaking about it. So here we go. We'll start with Pearl Harbor radio broadcast from that day. Here we go.
We take you now to Washington.
The details are not available. They will be in a few minutes. The White House is now giving out a statement. The attack apparently was made on all naval and military activities on the principal island of Oahu. The president's brief statement was read to reporters by Stephen Early, the president's secretary. A Japanese attack upon Pearl Harbor naturally would mean war. Such an attack would naturally bring a counterattack, and hostilities of this kind would naturally mean that the president would ask Congress for a declaration of war. There is no doubt from the temper of Congress that such a declaration would be granted. This morning, Secretary Hull talked with the Secretaries of War and of the Navy. Now the two special Japanese envoys, Admiral Nomura and Special Envoy Caruso, are at the State Department, engaged in conference with Secretary of State Hull. Their appearance at the State Department on this Sunday afternoon emphasizes the gravity of the Far Eastern situation, where hostilities now seem to be actually opening over the whole South Pacific. Even more important than the visit of Tokyo's diplomats is this news which comes from Pearl Harbor and the news which comes from South Asia. Whatever the diplomats from Tokyo or the cabinet in Tokyo may be saying, there is a conviction in official quarters here that Japan has now cast the die. All the bits of information which came to the State Department and the Navy yesterday and today indicated that Japanese transports containing troops were steaming into the Gulf of Thailand. Japanese warships were providing a heavy escort. Having rounded the southernmost point of French Indochina, the convoy had as its only obvious destination Bangkok, the capital of Thailand. It was on the basis of this information that President Roosevelt sent to Emperor Hirohito of Japan his personal message last night, a message which appealed to the Mikado for restraint and peace. It seemed to be a final plea from the United States. And if the activities today are substantiated, it is a final plea. Or if Japanese troops attempt to capture Bangkok or attack Pearl Harbor, the balance, the delicate balance, which has maintained peace in South Asia is destroyed. The four powers, the United States, Britain, the Dutch East Indies, and Australia, have given Japan ample warning that invasion of Thailand would mean counteraction by the associated powers. These Japanese envoys, Nomura and Kurusu, requested the appointment with Mr. Hull today. The engagement was set for 1:45 p.m. They arrived some minutes late and in turn were kept waiting before the door to Mr. Hull's office was opened to them at 2:20. In the meantime, the President had prepared the statement which announced that Japan was attacking Pearl Harbor from the air. It is possible that the Tokyo diplomats wanted again to assure the State Department that the reports of Japanese troop movements in French Indochina were exaggerated. They did that once before on instructions from Tokyo when the President propounded his question about those movements last Tuesday. At that time, Tokyo replied that the movements were in North Indochina to offset Chinese movements on the Indochina border. The specific information of the State Department now and then was that the bulk of the Japanese troops were being moved to South Indochina, where they were in a better position to threaten Thailand. The President's plea to Emperor Hirohito was also supported by a note of warning. The warning is supported by developments and preparations in this capital. The meeting between Secretary Hull and the Secretaries of War and Navy this morning was an example of the plans that are being laid. It would be a mistake for Japan to believe that these preparations are any kind of bluff. Although officials in Washington are silent on what would be the definite consequences of a Japanese attack on Hawaii or an attack on Thailand, there are indications of what is being considered and the steps which may be taken this very afternoon. The first would be a severance of diplomatic relations with Tokyo. An immediate naval blockade in which the American Navy would take a leading part, along with British units, is the other probability. Both these steps could be taken by the President on his own executive authority. But an effective naval blockade, of course, could not continue long without hostilities. As a matter of fact, according to the President's announcement, those hostilities are already underway with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. And just now comes the word from the President's office that a second air attack has been reported on Army and Navy bases in Manila. Thus, we have official announcements from the White House that Japanese airplanes have attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii and have now attacked Army and Navy bases in Manila. We return you now to New York and will give you later information as it comes along from the White House. Return you now to New York.
This is John Daly speaking from the CBS newsroom in New York. Here is the Far East situation as reported to this moment. The Japanese have attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and our defense facilities at Manila, capital of the Philippines. The first disclosure of this news was made by Presidential Secretary Stephen Early by telephone at approximately 2:25 in Washington. I read the text of this historic announcement at a little after 2:30. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor from the air, and all naval and military activities on the island of Oahu, the principal American base in the Hawaiian Islands. That was Secretary Early's message. Short while later, he dictated another message. A second air attack has been reported. This one has been made on the Army and Navy bases in Manila. And here's a last-minute Associated Press flash from Honolulu. A naval engagement is in progress off Honolulu with at least one black enemy aircraft carrier in action against the Pearl Harbor defenses. Secretary Early informed all correspondents and then rushed to the White House to be with President Roosevelt. As the announcement was made, the two Japanese envoys, Ambassador Nomura and Special Emissary Kurusu, were at the State Department. Columbia's correspondent in London, Bob Trout, heard the news for the first time from our report from New York. Up to that moment, or very shortly before then, the British capital had not been informed of the Japanese attack on the Hawaiian Islands and on Manila. In view of Prime Minister Churchill's recent pledge that a British declaration of war on Japan would follow almost immediately upon the outbreak of war between Japan and the United States, a British announcement is expected soon. Columbia's correspondent, Ford Wilkins, was put on the air in CBS's regular 2:30 news program on Sunday afternoon from Manila. He was cut off the air suddenly while he was talking about air raid shelters, possibly because of censorship. In communication with Columbia's radio station, KGMB in Honolulu, we heard here in New York that the Pearl Harbor base had been attacked and anti-aircraft fire was heard. A telephone message to the United Press from Fort Schaefer in Hawaii said that 50 planes attacked the island of Oahu. The planes were officially described so far as unidentified in these messages, although later reports that have come in from the press associations definitely identify at least 2 of these planes as carrying the emblem of the rising sun, the emblem of Japan. The Pearl Harbor attack reported by KGMB in Honolulu is said to have been carried out in other messages by 50 to 100 planes, and a half an hour ago it was said to be still continuing. The smoke of anti-aircraft guns rose over the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard. Heavy smoke also drifted up from Hickam Field in the Pearl Harbor area, apparently from fires, and witnesses said fires broke out on Ford Island. The main targets in this action by the Japanese appeared to be Hickman Field, which is the Army field, and the great naval base at Pearl Harbor, and several planes were reported shot down. Also, we've had a report from Honolulu that policemen and firemen were ordered in a radio broadcast to go to Army and Navy posts immediately. Major George Fielding Elliott, when this dispatch originally came in, pointed out that this may indicate that some of the Japanese resident in that area are being aids in this action by the Japanese against the shore areas, and the firemen and policemen may have been called up to stop any abortive revolutionary action in that area. Here's the first Associated Press dispatch from Honolulu. At least 2 Japanese bombers, their wings bearing the insignia of the rising sun, appeared over Honolulu at about 7:35 a.m. Honolulu time today and dropped bombs. As I told you a little earlier, these are the 2 planes of the reported 50 to 100 which have been definitely identified as wearing the insignia of the rising sun. Unverified reports said that a foreign warship appeared off Pearl Harbor and has begun firing at the defenses of that mighty fortified post. Reports also say that the Japanese bombers scored 2 hits, one at Hickman Field Air Corps Post on Oahu Island, and the other at Pearl Harbor, which set an oil tank afire. American anti-aircraft has set up a terrific din, and the sky also is filled with American battle aircraft.
Go ahead, Honolulu.
The island of Oahu in the Pacific, one of the most thickly populated islands of the Hawaiian group, was attacked by Japanese planes this morning, starting at about 8 o'clock. No one would believe when reports emanated from the 2 radio stations here that the islands had been attacked. But when bombs began falling in various parts of the city and in different Army and Navy posts and bases, people knew Japan was endeavoring to eradicate America's outpost in the Pacific. Now, here's a report that I've gathered from different reporters of the Honolulu Advertiser who've been out endeavoring to get information concerning the Japanese air attack on the island of Oahu in the Hawaiian Islands. The first information in Honolulu that planes of Japan were attacking the islands was about 8 o'clock this morning, Hawaiian time. The first group of Japanese airplanes attacked Ford Island at Pearl Harbor, the Navy's mighty fortress in the islands. Roy Batusik, a local attorney, was up in his private plane flying over Cocoa Head when he said 1 or 2 Japanese planes gave him a salute of machine gun bullets as they approached the city. The plane was slightly damaged, and Mr. Batusik made a landing. After machine gunning Ford Island, the first Japanese planes moved to Hickam Field. Observers said considerable damage was done to planes and to Hickam Field. There is great activity there now in clearing the field of debris. At Pearl Harbor, where is based the Pacific Fleet, 3 ships were attacked. The Oklahoma was set afire. All lines of communication seem to be down between the various Army posts and Navy aerodromes and Army airfields. There has been no statement made by the Navy. The Army has issued orders for all people, the civilian population, to remain off the streets. The first raiders carried torpedoes and did their damage to shipping in Pearl Harbor and off Honolulu. Everyone here in the islands were taken by surprise by the attack, and even yet it's difficult for some people to believe that our air raid on these beautiful islands has actually happened and that lives have been lost. Several planes have been shot down, and anti-aircraft gunnery is very heavy. It is thought that the planes came from the south in the direction of the island of Kauai. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Hickam Field and Wheeler Field, several squadrons of Japanese planes came in from the south over Diamond Head, dropping bombs and incendiary bombs over the city. One bomb dropped in front of the governor's mansion at Washington Place and killed one man. Another dropped by the Honolulu Advertiser, nearly hitting several people and almost reaching its mark. At Pacific Heights and Dowsett Highlands, beautiful residential districts, there was heavy bombing. One woman was killed in Dowsett Highlands. The governor has proclaimed a state of emergency. Traffic is almost at a standstill in parts of the city. However, the traffic to and from Waikiki seems to be normal. When Japanese planes appeared over Waikiki, there were many people out in the streets and watched the bombing there. One man at Waikiki was badly injured when a bomb dropped in the heart of that beach resort. The Japanese planes seem to have come over the city and the environs with no intimation whatsoever that these were Japanese planes. And it was a very difficult for people here to believe that these were Japanese planes. Here's a report that just came from Hickam Field. There were 350 men killed in a direct bomb hit on the barracks at Hickam Field. Then at Bellows Field, on the other side of the island, on the windward side of the islands, the field was bombed very heavily. That's all the news from Honolulu now. We'll be back with more news at a later time. This is KGU in Honolulu, Hawaii.
Now, it's hard for me to imagine what people had to be feeling or thinking, listening to the radio and hearing those reports. And then you have to ask, some of these reports are from some of the networks, obviously in the major cities. How were people hearing the news in other areas and other parts of the country? When did they find some may not even, again, this is speculation. Obviously, I was not alive. I would assume many didn't even know maybe until the next day when they read a newspaper. Because how information traveled. But for those listening to those reports, it had to feel like the world was about to come to an end. It had to be a time of fear and yet for some people, anger. And can you imagine if you were 16, 17, 18, knowing that, you had to know that many were already looking to sign up, but your life was getting ready to be defined by entering into a world war. It's hard to even comprehend how people could feel. And you have to ask yourself, how would we respond how would the culture in 2019 respond if we were attacked by an army, another nation, attacking, a major part of the United States of America? How would America respond to a world war in 2019, 2020? Something to think about. But let's listen to the only live news report. Now, again, this comes to us from the Smithsonian. They added some sound effects. I don't really like that, but at least you kind of get an idea of one of the only live news reports that aired. It was only like 2 minutes, and the reporter gets cut off. It's just bizarre, but here is that report.
And now we take you to Honolulu. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hello, NBC. Hello, NBC. This is KGU in Honolulu, Hawaii. I am speaking from the roof of the Advertiser Publishing Company building. We have witnessed this morning considerable damage done. This battle has been going on for nearly 3 hours. It is no joke. It is a real war. We cannot estimate yet how much damage has been done, but it has been a very severe attack. The Navy and Army appear now to have the air and the sea under control. Just a minute. May I interrupt this just a second, please? This is the telephone company, the chief operator. Yes. We try to get through on an emergency call. Could you tell me? Well, we're talking to New York now. Please do. 1, 2.
One moment, please.
That's the only live news report we have, at least for my research. That's the only one. And it's just bizarre. He's trying to give you some information, and then they get cut off, and that's the end. And so that's why information was so delayed, and that's why if you go back on Sirius XM satellite radio, they have a channel called Radio Classics, which I would strongly recommend people listening to if you love radio drama from that time. But I haven't looked today, but a lot of times on December the 7th, they will play all the audio that they have from that period of time. But it has the music and the programs that were going on. And it's like unless you were tuned in at the exact time of a bulletin being issued, you wouldn't even known what was going on because you were just listening as music, and then all of a sudden they'd break in with a news report about, we have reports that Pearl Harbor is under attack. Back to music, back to our programming. They didn't have a lot of information, and when the only live news report gets cut off like that, and as you heard in some of those other reports, that people were in disbelief. They didn't believe it was happening, and they didn't know if it was even the Japanese. And there was so many questions and so much confusion. But as those who are hearing those reports, again, had to feel like the end of the world. And again, it just makes you question, how would we handle that in 2019? I'll obviously never forget the attacks of September the 11th, 2001. I'll never forget that. That was, I could tell you the story of my day. That was, wow, that was a crazy day. But it is interesting. So here is the next day. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, in his famous speech, declaring war on Japan. Here we go.
Senators and representatives, I have the distinguished honor of presenting the President of the United States.
Mr. Vice President, Mr. Speaker, members of the Senate, of the House of Representatives, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation, and at the solicitation of Japan, was still in conversation with its government and its emperor, looking toward the maintenance of peace in the Pacific. The attack yesterday on the Hawaiian Islands has caused severe damage to American naval and military forces. I regret to tell you that very many American lives have been lost. In addition, American ships have been reported torpedoed on the high seas between San Francisco and Honolulu. As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I have directed that all measures be taken for our defense, but always will our whole nation remember the character of the onslaught against us. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory. I believe that I interpret the will of the Congress and of the people when I assert that we will not only defend ourselves to the uttermost, but will make it very certain that this form of treachery shall never again endanger us. Hostilities exist. There is no blinking at the fact that our people, our territory, and our interests are in grave danger. With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph. So help us God. I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
So what lessons can we learn from December the 7th, 1941? I will leave that for you to consider and think about. Obviously, from a theological perspective, I hear all of this. It reminds me of man's depravity. War has existed in human history time and time again, nation against nation, brother against brother, people against people, race against race, war, violence, death, destruction. It's a part of the human condition, our sinful nature, and it's why we need a Savior. We need salvation in Jesus Christ. Obviously, we could talk along about that. But it just does remind me that from a spiritual perspective, again, this is a theological podcast, we're in a spiritual war, and I know that I don't always think that I am. And I know that there's probably chances that you don't as well. It's interesting that during times of great war and danger, how people, Republican and Democrat, and people come together to fight the enemy. And as Christians, obviously we have to maintain sometimes denominational lines because of theological issues, and we should not compromise on that. But individual Christians within one church, within a local body, should be the most unified people together, because we should all understand that we're in a war together. We have an enemy who roams about seeking whom he may devour to destroy us. We have an enemy inside of us. We have our own flesh, and we have the world. And we should be unified at least within local denominations, a denomination or a local body, unified. But sometimes I think we don't realize we're in a war. And so Christians will begin to argue within a local church and fight amongst one another, and local churches will split and fights within a denomination. Now, sometimes those fights are spiritual in nature, but we need to realize we are in a war, and I think we often forget that. But there you have it, just some audio from December the 7th, 1941, and some audio from December the 8th, 1941. Wow. I cannot even imagine living at that time. I can't even imagine living during the time of World War II or World War I. I don't even know. I would have really believed the world was coming to an end. I don't even know. It's just staggering to even imagine. And I don't know. It's hard for me to comprehend. And it would be hard for me to comprehend how we would handle it now. I don't know how we would handle it now, but it is something to think about. It's a part of our history. And we should know it, and we should see what we can learn from it. All right, thank you for listening to this live broadcast. If you'd like to email me your thoughts about what happened in World War II, December the 7th, 1941, spiritual war, anything, email me at newsif@yahoo.com, newsif@yahoo.com. Thank you for listening. Have a great day. God bless.